By the age of 8, this young Pluto in Scorpio had already witnessed his second murder. Walking home from McNair Elementary School, he passed by Tam's Burgers, the familiar smell of sizzling patties filling the air. He barely noticed the man in the drive-thru ordering his food until moments later. Another man appeared out of nowhere, shooting the man that was ordering the food down in broad daylight. The air froze as the young boy stood there, watching as a life was violently stolen. For most, such an event would be a shock, but for this Pluto in Scorpio, it was just another day and another part of life in Compton, California. And this young Pluto in Scorpio was no stranger to chaos. It surrounded him constantly. It was rooted within his community, within his family, and within his own bloodline. The little boy was observant and always a little removed from the madness that surrounded him. After all, Pluto and Scorpios are known for their keen observation skills and their ability to be a part of destruction. And as his childhood unfolded, he would learn important lessons about power, loyalty, and loss. The world he lived in was shaped by allegiances, hard choices, and unspoken codes in Compton. For this little Pluto in Scorpio, gang affiliations ran deep within his family's history. His father, originally from Chicago, had been entrenched in the gang life, and his mother had spent years trying to hold the family together, putting up with the threats that came with that kind of lifestyle. But there came a point when she could no longer stand by and live this kind of life. "I can't help you if you're not willing to help yourself," she told her husband. With that ultimatum, and only $500, the family packed 2 black trash bags stuffing everything they owned in them and boarded a train bound for San Bernardino, California. But fate had other plans. They ended up in Compton, where an aunt agreed to help the family get a hotel room to stay in until they could get on their feet. And slowly, over time, they saved enough to get their own place. And it was in that very home that they would bring the Pluto and Scorpio boy home from the hospital. And as he grew up, his mother prayed and always reminded the young boy of the duality of the world he was growing up in. "Don't get caught up in the streets," she would warn, pointing to the endless destruction that came with that kind of life. She would show him through the choices of the men that was around him what could happen when one succumbed to the pull of gangs, drugs, and violence. The allure was still strong, though. The streets offered loyalty, a sense of belonging, and the promise of wealth, things that the boy didn't see in the traditional routes that society offered. One summer afternoon, his Uncle Calvin pulled up to the house in a lowrider with a sound system that was blaring music. His uncle was the embodiment of street charisma. He was larger than life, super magnetic, and always surrounded by people. He was able to make a whole room laugh when he was there. The young Pluto in Scorpio could hardly take his eyes off him as Calvin, with a cigarette dangling from his lips, scooped him up. "Aye, little nephew." While on his uncle's lap, the young boy couldn't help but notice the red bandana tied around his uncle's wrist, a symbol of belonging that Calvin wore like a badge of honor. And with that bandana came a life that was filled with power, money, cars, women, drugs, friends, respect, and loyalty. What more could a man want? When Uncle Calvin would leave, the boy's mother would shake her head, reminding him that his uncle had made his choices, but the young boy still had his whole life ahead of him and should not follow his uncle. Still, despite her words, the boy felt an undeniable pull towards the lifestyle that Calvin represented. One day, his uncle came and picked him up and took him through a drive through the streets of Compton. The city was alive with activity. Kids played in the street, old men shot dice on the side, and cars cruised around. Uncle Calvin pointed out places in the town where he had memories. Over there was the liquor store where he made his first sell, and over there was the alley where he almost got killed. He turned to his nephew. "You gotta stay sharp out here, little nephew. Compton ain't a place for mistakes." The young Pluto in Scorpio tried to process it all, although he didn't fully understand it just quite yet. And as they returned to the house, Calvin turned to him. "You're smarter than I ever was, little nephew. Don't let this place hold you down." Over time, the boy began to see both sides of his uncle's life. Sure, he was loved, admired, and respected. But his uncle was always looking over his shoulder, and he always was unsure of who could be trusted. The young Pluto and Scorpio learned that the streets weren't just a setting, they were a system, one that could both empower and trap those who became entangled in it. To make sense of it all, the boy started writing. He had notebooks filled with lyrics, poetry, and raw emotions. Words became his outlet, his way of processing everything he saw and felt. He was a gifted storyteller, able to weave narratives that spoke to people's souls and made people think. But for a long time, he kept his words to himself, unsure of what to do with them. One day, in English class, he had an assignment due. He was supposed to have written a poem, but he had totally forgotten. So he hurried up and scribbled down verses just before the teacher collected the papers. The next day, the teacher handed back the papers with the grades on them. And as he passed them out, the Pluto and Scorpio saw the C's and the D's on the papers of his classmates, and he just knew he was doomed. But much to his surprise, when his teacher handed him his paper, he saw an A written at the top. That moment was a revelation to this young Pluto and Scorpio. It was as if the universe was telling him, this is your path, this is your power. He realized then that his words mattered, and that he could craft poems and lyrics that meant something, and that could transform the way that people thought and felt. So just who was this young Pluto and Scorpio boy who witnessed all kinds of chaos, but was able to use his gift of writing to transform other people's points of view? Well, it was none other than Kendrick Lamar, the rapper, songwriter, and lyrical genius known for his thought-provoking lyrics and his ability to transform not only his own life from poverty and violence, but also of those who listened to his powerful words. And now you know what is up, my buttercups.